Okay, so today is all about mutations and genetic diversity. Okay, so first we're going to talk about disorders that arise from recessive traits. And so what does that mean? Well, basically it means that you have two alleles, and both of those alleles are affected. Meaning you got one allele from your mother that was affected and the other allele from your father that was affected. And so when you look at this Punnett square here on the right on the right-hand side, you'll notice that 1 in 4 chance in this particular case, when you have both a mother and a father who are unaffected, at having a child who is completely deaf. And so in this case, both of your parents must be carriers. Some of the most common recessive disorders are albinism, Tay-Sachs, and cystic fibrosis. It also should be noted that most human disorders are actually recessive disorders. And so much less common are dominant disorders, or disorders that arise from dominant traits, meaning all you need is one copy from either mom or dad to be actually affected. And so if we look at this chart here on the right hand side, you'll notice that in this case 2 of the children were affected and then 2 were unaffected, and that's because dad was actually heterozygous, so he only had one copy, but even though he only had one copy, he was still affected. So even an affected person, if they're heterozygous for a particular allele, can have unaffected progeny or children, but it's much more likely that you have an autosomal dominant disorder be passed on from one generation to the next. And so remember, just because it's a dominant allele doesn't necessarily mean it's more common than the recessive allele. And so if you think about it, because I think you guys always think kind of the recessive allele, it's kind of ingrained in your head that that is the bad thing. Sometimes having 2 copies of that recessive allele is a good thing. So some common dominant disorders, polydactyly, which basically means you have many fingers, more than 5 fingers. Achondroplasia, which is basically a type of dwarfism. And so we look at dwarfism as an example of that. 99.9% of humans are actually homozygous recessive for dwarfism. And it's when you are not homozygous recessive, when you have one copy of that dominant gene, that you are actually affected with achondroplasia. And so if we think about dominant disorders, there are very few that are lethal. And the reason for that is that, well, if you have it and if you have one copy of it, then you basically would die. And so how are they even present? Well, if you think about it, the only way that a dominant disorder is going to live on and pass from one generation to the next is if it affects somebody after the reproductive bearing age. And so an example of that is Huntington's disease, which is basically early onset dementia. It happens to females between 40 and 50 years old. And so they've already had children in most cases and potentially have had affected children they don't know. And then last, there are sex-linked disorders. And so these are disorders caused by recessive alleles. And so if we look at this pedigree on the right-hand side here, so remember back to when I first mentioned pedigrees, a couple things you need to know is that the squares represent males, the circles represent females. If you're affected, you have a fully colored in shape. If you're a carrier, you have a half colored in shape. And if you're unaffected, then you have essentially an empty shape. And so some of the most common sex-linked disorders, red-green colorblindness. Actually, 1 in 20 males are actually colorblind to red-green hues, and hemophilia. Hemophilia is another. The one thing I want to point out, sex-linked disorders actually affect males more than they affect females. And I want you to think about why that is, and I'll give you a minute to think about that. So the reason why that is because most sex-linked disorders are located on the X chromosome, the X chromosome. And so if it's located on the X chromosome, if you think about males, they're XY, and females are XX. And if most disorders are caused by recessive alleles, the likelihood that a female has 2 affected X's versus a male having only 1 affected X is way less. So males are much more susceptible to X-linked disorders because they only have 1 X chromosome, and essentially they can't compensate with that other X chromosome. They only have a Y. Which is why there are way more colorblind males than there are colorblind females. It is, however, possible for a female to be colorblind, and that would basically mean that the dad was affected because he only has 1 X and he would have to be affected, and mom was at least a carrier or was affected, and that would mean that you get a colorblind female, but it's way more unlikely than a colorblind male. And also, I should note that whenever a male acquires colorblindness, if you think about how the genetics of it work, okay, how do you actually get a boy? So, if you do the Punnett square out, okay, so this is mom, this is dad. So mom's bringing the X, dad's bringing the X. Mom's bringing the X, dad's bringing the X. Mom's bringing the X, dad's bringing the Y. Mom's bringing the X, dad's bringing the Y. Okay. And now, so what exactly happened there is that mom, in each case when you have a boy, is the one providing that X. And so if mom is providing the X, then that colorblindness gene is always therefore coming from mom. Okay, that's all I have for today.